everyone! This is Kimidori Cosplay, and this is my very first sewing tutorial. Please bear with me, this is my very first time being in front of camera, but I'm excited to show you a few things with a new medium. So what I thought I would do today is take a project, a very easy one, and show you sort of my process from start to finish. And the character that I picked for this tutorial is Kagamine Rin from VOCALOID. So I thought I would show you guys how I would make that and kind of talk about some very specific techniques along the way. Nothing too impressive for this round, but I thought it would be a place to start. So let's get started. So before we even touch any fabric, first and foremost is patterning. How do you go about picking a existing pattern versus going with the duct tape method? Now, some of you probably know I swear by the duct tape method only because you are basically giving birth to a brand new pattern that is very, very specific to your own body. I happen to be a body type that is very hard to accommodate, surprisingly enough. My 3 sizes, which I will not reveal here. I have the stereotypical Asian log body, if that makes sense, so there's not a whole lot of difference between the 3 measurements, unlike a lot of American patterns which tend to be very curvaceous, and so there is a lot of adjustment that has to happen for me in particular. But that being said, I have found a pattern that exists already that I found extremely useful, and it's been a great source for me that doesn't make me have to, you know, start from scratch every time. And that pattern is this one, Simplicity. It is 1715, and it's part of their Amazing Fit series. I really like this one because not only do you have your basic number sizes, like 6 through 14 or 16 or something like that, it also takes into consideration your cup size. So what you would do is you would first pick your numerical size based on their chart on the back, and then from there, for example, if I was a size 10, then I am an A cup, then I can look for the pattern that says 10 A cup and average fit. And that means it's the closest to my body type, and it tends to be very accurate for me, actually. So highly recommend this one. Those are some things I keep in mind, but for VOCALOID, I'm going to be using this pattern, and I'll show you how I use this as a base and sort of modify it as I go. So the last thing we need to talk about before we start sewing is materials. For Rin, there is not a whole lot to talk about just because it's such a basic top, but I've mentioned this previously before. Cotton sateen is basically my fabric of choice when it comes to cosplay. A few reasons why. There's a good amount of heft to it. There is some thickness. It's probably somewhere between a mid to bottom weight fabric, and you'll often notice that there is a very subtle sheen on the right side, on the outward facing side. That quality actually prevents the fabric from looking super flat in photos. I like having just a tiny bit of sheen, but nothing like, you know, polyester lining, like nothing super shiny. So that's definitely my go-to fabric. But for Rin, I did not get so lucky just because her dress, or her top, is white and yellow lines, or stripes I should say. It's not often that you come across the perfect fabric that has the correct stripe thickness, the correct shade. Not to mention we were trying to coordinate between 3 girls, and all 3 of us needed to have coordinated stripes. So what do you do at that point? You make your own. So basically what we did was we laid out our white cotton. We laid out lots and lots and lots of blue painter's tape and went at it with fabric paint. Believe it or not, it worked very well. This is mine. And as you can see on camera, you can't really tell. One thing is that when you touch it, it feels a tiny bit crunchy, like that fabric paint feel. But I imagine that a little bit of ironing and heat would help that, actually. If you take a look at the instructions written on the back side of a lot of fabric paints, sometimes it'll tell you to make sure you heat seal the fabric paint. Not all brands require that though, so make sure you take a look at that, but do know that this is an option. If you can't find the right stripes for your project, it is definitely an option to paint your own, even though it's a huge pain. So what you see here from left to right are the side, front, back, and front pieces of my torso. Only reason why the pattern pieces are not oriented all the way to the left side of the fabric is because I hadn't finished painting the stripes. So please do disregard that. Try to save as much fabric as you can for this project. What you'll notice on a lot of patterns is that the waistline is marked. It's helpful that they do that just because once the pieces are disassembled this way, it's really hard to tell where that waistline is. So this is going to act as an anchor point for when we add some flair to this product. First thing to do is to extend the length of this top. So I did that roughly by taking the front piece and putting it against my body and measuring very approximately how many inches I need to add. So I've established that I need 6 inches added to the length of this top overall. So I'm going to go ahead and add 6 inches to the ends of every one of these pieces. So Rin's shirt flares out starting at my waistline, so for my next step I'm going to go back to that anchor point that I mentioned earlier and start drawing a new line that extends outwards so I can add that flare. So the side front is done. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the back side. One thing I want to note, in this situation it doesn't apply too much just because it's a shirt, but if you are doing a skirt or a dress, make sure you add extra length in the very back, only because the natural curve of the rear actually does require extra material in order to cover everything appropriately. Also note that I'm adding a few inches around the collar line so that it's close to my neck. Also be sure you go through and cut out all the notches that are designated on the pattern pieces, mostly because these are going to help in terms of placement when you start assembling the pieces. For the front, this pattern has just one symmetrical piece, so on the pattern you'll notice there is an arrow denoting where there needs to be a fold so that when you open it up, it becomes symmetrical. So what I've done here is I'm opening up the fabric again, folding it in half so that the stripes will be facing the correct direction, consistent with the side, front, and the back pieces, and then aligning that arrow along the fold so that I can achieve that symmetry. Now I'm laying out the side front piece here and then matching up the stripes so that it matches the fabric as well, and then noticing the notches that are on the front piece and then lining them up with the notches that are on the side front. Place the front piece in a way that matches up the stripes as best as possible. Once that's done, I can go ahead and extend and flare out the front piece as I did with the others. I started by sewing darts on both of my back pieces. So these are all my pieces laid out. What I'm going to do is start by sewing the side fronts to the front piece, and you'll notice that I'm pinning the notches so that they match first. That's generally along the boob curve, and then once I've pinned that curve down, then I can go ahead and pin the rest of that length. Once you've sewed the pieces together, you have a lot of curves along the seam, and in order to get those to lay flat on your body, one of the best things to do is cut notches along the seam allowance, which allows that fabric to lay flat. As I go along, I generally like to serge all of my seam allowances rather than doing all of the serging at the very end. Now I'm ready to sew the back pieces to the front, so I'm again matching up the side torso notches and my shoulder notch. For this next step, what I'm going to recommend is you borrow a set of hands. At this stage, I like to fit the garment to my body directly, so I cut some notches along the neckline so that I can put it on somewhat comfortably, and then I borrow a set of hands and have them pin it to my body directly. You'll see in a second how he's pinning it to me. Generally the pins are running vertically up and down, and he's pulling the garment pretty close to my body as he goes down. Once the pins are in place, then you can have them take a pencil and mark where those pins are. These are going to denote where the zipper should go. Before removing the garment, make sure you take a pencil and draw a very light line where you want the collar to end. I'll explain in a little bit why I've only drawn half the neckline and not the entire thing. So here I've removed the garment and you can see the pencil lines. Note that the bottom part of my shirt is flared and it doesn't need to be fitted to my body, so it doesn't have any markings. What I'm doing is measuring half an inch away from those pencil marks and then drawing a solid line. The solid line is where I'm going to be cutting, and I'm doing this because I need to add half an inch seam allowance so that the markings actually show where the zipper will be. So here's my half-drawn collar line. I'm going to go ahead and extend this line to the back piece as well. Not going to worry too much about adding a seam allowance for this instance just because of the way I'm going to be sewing the collar on. But here I am cutting along that line up to the halfway point and then simply fold that over and then use that to trace the line on the other side as well. This ensures that the line drawn is perfectly symmetrical and it is the least cumbersome way to do it. So to attach the zipper, I take the two edges of the back pieces and sew them together with the right sides together, and I press the seam allowance open flat. This is going to sound weird, but next I'm going to sew down the zipper as shown. Once I've done that, I flip my garment inside out and then use a seam ripper to open up the initial stitching that I did along the back seam. I'm not going to go too much into detail about the sleeves just because I simply follow the instructions that are provided with the manufactured pattern. For this instance, I'm using a sleeve pattern that has just a little bit of puff to it, so it calls for some pleats along the shoulder seam. With the pleats in, I start by sewing the side seams of my sleeves and then turning it inside out so I get something like a tube. So with the sleeve right side out and the torso inside out, I start pinning the two together by matching up the notches first. Once the sleeves are on, I tried everything on, made sure that the fit was good. Then taking a pencil, I roughly mark where I want the sleeves to end. Once I have a rough line, I find that it's easier if I just flatten out the sleeve and then cut it. I use the cutoff piece to mark the line on the opposite sleeve. Before I go any further, I like to serge the raw edges on my sleeve ends and also the armholes. To hem the bottom of my shirt, I'm gonna trim off the irregular edges and then use some horsehair braid. You'll see what I've done is sewed the horsehair braid onto the right side of the fabric and then folded it over. To finish, I just top stitch it down. So to make the collar, the gist of what I'm doing is tracing half of the neckline onto some pattern paper and then building the collar shape from there. My basic understanding of collars is that by tracing the neckline, you allow the collar to lay flat. Whereas if I wanted the collar to stand straight up, then the bottom edge of my collar pattern piece would actually be a straight line. My collar is made up of 3 layers, 2 layers of cotton sateen with 1 layer of fusible interfacing in between. Once I've sewn the pieces with the right sides together, I go ahead and trim the seam allowance and cut little notches throughout. This ensures that there won't be any kinks in the curve when I turn the collar inside out. To attach the collar, I stitched the collar onto the neckline on the right side, and then I'm going to use some bias tape to cover up the raw edge. Add some buttons and you're done! From here, I'm going to breeze through a very quick time lapse of how I made each of the accessories. Alright, so that wraps up my very first video tutorial. Thanks so much for watching, you guys. This is still a huge, steep learning curve for me, and I'm not quite sure what steps to show all the time. I did try to include all the steps along the way, but I'm sure I've missed a few things along the way as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me on my page. Whether direct message or as a comment, I do not care. I will look at them all equally. But I hope, any part of that was useful. I'm sure a lot of it is actually repetitive of other tutorials, and a lot of it is very basic information. I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but I figured that it would be interesting, for some people anyway, to see what my procedure is and what kind of things are going through my head when I pull something together like this. And again, this is a very easy project. I highly recommend it for anybody of any skill level, really. And everything that I showed in this tutorial is applicable to so many different projects. So I hope you have a lot of success with your projects, and looking forward to potentially the next one in the future. Anyway, thanks guys!